The air in Aurelia was not merely air, it was a carefully curated atmosphere, a substance thick with the scent of old money, black truffles, and the faint floral perfume of women who had never known a day of labor. It clung to the heavy velvet drapes and settled upon the polished marble floors, muffling the sounds of the outside world until all that remained was the delicate symphony of power. The soft clinking of silver cutlery against porcelain, the hushed murmur of billion-dollar deals being brokered over seared foie gras, and the ghost-like footsteps of the staff who moved through it all. The chandeliers above were not just light fixtures, they were frozen constellations, each crystal droplet refracting the candlelight into 1,000 tiny rainbows, casting a golden, forgiving glow upon the faces of the titans of industry who dined beneath them. This was a sanctuary built for the masters of the universe, a place where the chasm between those who served and those who were served was as deep and as silent as the ocean floor, an unspoken covenant that governed every interaction. Elara Vance moved through this gilded world with an economy of motion that bordered on invisibility. Her black uniform was impeccably pressed, a stark silhouette against the room's opulent warmth, and her hair was pulled back so tightly that it offered no distraction. She was a study in professional deference, her hands steady as she poured a 1982 Chateau Margaux into a waiting glass, her posture perfect, her expression a placid mask of polite neutrality. To the patrons of Aurelia, she was a pair of hands, a quiet voice confirming an order, a fleeting presence that anticipated a need before it was spoken. She was part of the exquisite machinery of the place, as functional and as unheeded as the polished silverware. But beneath this veneer of quiet servitude, a different reality churned. Her mind was a fortress, a library of legal precedent and financial statutes, a place where the quiet hum of the restaurant was drowned out by the echoes of courtroom arguments and the rustle of case law pages she had once devoured. Every clink of a champagne flute against another was a sound that transported her back to a different time, a different life. It reminded her of the delicate sound of glass beakers in her father's laboratory, a small, ethical biotech firm he had built from the ground up with a dream of curing rare pediatric diseases. That dream and the man who held it had been shattered. The memory was a shard of glass lodged permanently in her heart. The blur of legal documents filled with predatory language, the cold finality of the bankruptcy notice, and the image of her father, a man once so vibrant, collapsing from a massive stroke, his face a canvas of disbelief and betrayal. That single, brutal moment had ended everything. It had ended her scholarship to Yale Law School, where she had been the star pupil, the prodigy destined for greatness. It had ended her future and chained her to the present, a relentless cycle of long shifts and mounting medical bills for the man who now lay in a quiet room, his brilliant mind trapped in a body that had surrendered. Her secret was a weapon she never intended to wield again, a skill set that felt like a relic from a buried life. She possessed a mind that was a steel trap for information, an encyclopedic and near-photographic memory for the labyrinthine complexities of corporate law. She could hear a fragment of a conversation about a merger and, in seconds, mentally map out the entire legal framework, identify the loopholes, and predict the regulatory hurdles. She saw the world not in colors and shapes, but in clauses, precedents, and SEC filings. It was a gift that had once promised her a brilliant career, a seat at the tables she now cleared. But now it was a silent torment, a constant, running commentary on the very world that had crushed her family. She served men who discussed the very strategies, the hostile takeovers, the asset stripping, the predatory short-selling that had been used as weapons against her father, and she did it with a calm, steady hand while a silent fury brewed in her soul. The atmosphere in Aurelia, already charged with its own sense of self-importance, shifted palpably when Marcus Thorne arrived. It was not a loud entrance, but it was an absolute one. The air itself seemed to part for him. The maitre d', a man who exuded an unshakable stoicism, suddenly became a study in obsequious deference, his posture bending as if pulled by Thorne's gravitational field. Thorne did not walk into the room. He took possession of it. He was a man sculpted from arrogance and bespoke tailoring, his suit a dark armor of impossible expense. He moved with the predatory grace of a shark, his eyes sweeping across the room not with curiosity, but with the casual disdain of an emperor surveying his domain. He handed his coat to a waiting attendant without a glance, his attention already fixed on the young, eager associate trailing in his wake, a disciple desperate to bask in the glow of his ruthless power. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City. But first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. Thorne and his associate were seated at the best table in the house, a corner booth that offered both privacy and a commanding view of the entire restaurant. Ilara was assigned their section. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs, a familiar rhythm of dread she had learned to control. She approached the table, her water pitcher held in a steady grip. Thorne did not acknowledge her presence with so much as a flicker of an eye. He was deep into a monologue, his voice a low, confident rumble meant to both instruct and intimidate his young companion. He spoke of his latest target, a mid-sized tech company, dissecting its vulnerabilities with surgical precision. He used a dense tapestry of financial jargon, leveraged buyouts, poison pills, mezzanine financing, smirking as he did, a performer relishing his own brilliance, utterly convinced that the world was divided into those who understood his language and the insignificant masses who did not. As Ilara moved silently to refill his water glass, he leaned in closer to his associate, his voice dropping slightly, though still loud enough for her to hear every venomous word. He was laying out the final brutal phase of his strategy, a plan designed not just to acquire the company inexpensively, but to utterly humiliate its founder. He gestured dismissively with a hand adorned with a heavy gold ring, the metal glinting under the chandelier light. He was performing his power, using the public space and the invisible servant beside him as props in his theater of dominance. The associate hung on his every word, his expression a mixture of awe and fear. Thorne, feeling the young man's rapt attention, decided to punctuate his lesson with a final, crushing display of his own superiority, a casual cruelty aimed at the nearest, most convenient target. He paused, taking a deliberate sip of the water she had just poured, his cold eyes finally lifting to meet hers for the first time. The look was not one of recognition or even basic human acknowledgement. It was the look one gives to a piece of furniture, an inanimate object. A small, cruel smile played on his lips. He turned back to his associate, but his words were aimed directly at her, a dart dipped in poison. "It's a beautiful strategy," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Too complex for the common mind to grasp, right, sweetheart?" The word, sweetheart, landed with the force of a physical slap. In that single moment, something within Ilara, something long dormant and heavily guarded, snapped. The practiced calm on her face did not waver, but inside, a glacial rage began to solidify in her veins. The image of her father, frail and broken in his hospital bed, flashed behind her eyes, superimposed over the arrogant, smiling face of the man who had put him there. The humiliation was no longer just hers. It was a desecration of her family's memory, and the time for silent endurance was over. For a frozen eternity that stretched between two heartbeats, the world in Aurelia ceased to spin. The condescending word, sweetheart, hung in the opulent air, a dissonant chord in the restaurant's symphony of wealth. For Ilara, it was not merely an insult. It was a key turning in a lock she had sealed shut years ago, opening a floodgate of memory and pain. The image of her father, not in his hospital bed but in his prime, his face alight with passion as he explained the intricate dance of protein folding, filled her mind's eye. He was a man of science and gentle integrity, a builder, a healer. And this man, this predator in a bespoke suit, was a destroyer, a man who built his empire on the rubble of dreams like her father's. The cold fury that had been a low ember in her soul for years suddenly roared to life, a silent, all-consuming inferno. It did not make her tremble. It made her preternaturally still, as if the fire had forged the very air around her into a solid, unbreachable wall. The associate, a young man named David, watched the scene with a dawning sense of confusion. He had seen his boss verbally eviscerate board members and crush competitors with a single, cutting phrase. This was different. This was a casual, thoughtless cruelty, a flick of the wrist to swat a fly. He expected the waitress to flinch, to murmur an apology, to simply disappear as she was meant to. He did not expect the absolute stillness that fell over her. A stillness so profound it felt like a physical presence at the table. He saw her spine, which had been professionally straight, somehow become straighter, as if an invisible rod of steel had just been fused to her vertebrae. Her gaze, which had been dutifully averted, slowly lifted, and for the first time, he saw her eyes. They were not the eyes of a servant. They were the eyes of a judge, clear, cold, and utterly devoid of fear, and they were fixed on Marcus Thorne with an intensity that made the air crackle. Marcus Thorne himself felt a flicker of annoyance, the kind a king might feel if a court jester suddenly forgot his lines. The woman was supposed to be invisible, a ghost in a black uniform. Her continued presence, her unblinking stare, was a breach of the unspoken contract of this world. He was about to wave his hand, a gesture of imperious dismissal, but he stopped. There was something in her posture, in the deliberate way she was breathing, that was unnervingly familiar. It was the calm of a high-stakes poker player who knows they hold the winning hand, the absolute certainty of a chess master who sees the board 10 moves ahead. He felt a prickle of unease on the back of his neck, an alien sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. He had built an empire on his ability to read people, to find their weaknesses and exploit them, but as he looked at this waitress, he found nothing to read but a placid, terrifying calm. Then she moved. The motion was not hurried or nervous. It was deliberate, precise, and imbued with a significance that silenced the table. She gently placed the heavy crystal water pitcher onto the white linen tablecloth. The sound it made was not a clatter, but a soft, definitive thud, a period at the end of a sentence that had not yet been spoken. It was the sound of a gavel falling in a silent courtroom. With that single, small action, the power dynamic at the table irrevocably shifted. She was no longer a servant attending to their needs. She was an authority, a presence that commanded their full, undivided attention. She folded her hands in front of her, her fingers interlaced, a picture of composure that belied the storm raging within her. The mask of the deferential waitress had not just cracked, it had disintegrated, revealing the formidable intellect that lay beneath. Her voice, when it came, was not loud. It was perfectly modulated, clear and calm, yet it cut through the murmuring ambiance of the restaurant like a shard of ice. It carried the weight of years of suppressed knowledge, of a life stolen and a future denied. She addressed Thorne directly, her eyes never leaving his. "That loophole you mentioned," she began, her tone conversational but laced with an undeniable authority. "The one you plan to use to devalue the acquisition target's intellectual property assets before the final tender offer." The specificity of her words made the young associate, David, sit bolt upright. This was not a guess. This was a direct quote from their private, high-level strategy discussion not 10 minutes prior. He looked at Thorne, whose faint, arrogant smile was beginning to look frozen and unnatural on his face. She continued, her voice a steady, rhythmic cadence of devastating facts. "You're referring to a creative interpretation of Section 287C of the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. The clause that once allowed for certain asset revaluations in pre-merger scenarios under specific safe harbor provisions." Her recitation of the legal code was flawless, the numbers and terms flowing from her as if she were reading from a textbook imprinted on the inside of her eyelids. The air grew thick with tension. Thorne's face, once a mask of smug confidence, was slowly contorting into a canvas of disbelief. He was no longer looking at a waitress. He was looking at an adversary, one who had appeared from nowhere, armed with knowledge she had no right to possess. His mind, usually a whirlwind of strategic calculations, went completely, utterly blank. "However," she said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming even more precise, more cutting, "that interpretation was rendered obsolete 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days ago. It was nullified by the landmark Supreme Court ruling in SEC versus Sterling Financial Group. The precedent established in that case closed that specific loophole permanently. The court found that any such pre-merger asset devaluation, when not disclosed transparently to all shareholders, constitutes a direct and prosecutable form of securities fraud." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle into the suffocating silence that now enveloped their table. The legal terminology, the case precedent, the sheer, undeniable accuracy of her statement was a multi-pronged assault on Thorne's entire sense of reality. He felt as if the marble floor beneath his feet had suddenly turned to quicksand. Her gaze then flickered for a moment to the associate, David, a silent acknowledgement of his presence, before returning to Thorne with renewed intensity. "Proceeding with your current strategy would not be a clever manipulation of the law. It would be a felony. It would expose you and your firm to SEC investigation, shareholder lawsuits, and potential criminal indictment. Your associate would likely be considered a co-conspirator, his career ending before it even began. For a man of your stature, the reputational damage alone would be catastrophic, far exceeding any potential profit from this acquisition." She was no longer just correcting him. She was dissecting his entire plan, laying bare its illegality with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon exposing a diseased organ. She was handing him his own ruin on a silver platter. And then she delivered the final devastating blow. She leaned forward ever so slightly, the movement intimate and menacing. Her voice dropped to a whisper, a sound meant only for Thorne and his shell-shocked associate, a whisper that carried the weight of a decade of pain. "A man like you should know the law," she murmured, the sound barely audible above the distant clinking of silverware. "But then again, you never did care much for the law. Not when it was inconvenient. Not when it stood in the way of a profit." Her eyes, which had been cold and analytical, now blazed with a righteous fire that had been banked for years. The final 4 words landed like hammer blows against his soul. "You ruined my family." The statement was not an accusation, it was a verdict, delivered with the quiet finality of a death sentence. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound from their corner of the world. Marcus Thorne, a man who commanded boardrooms with the force of his voice and moved markets with a single phone call, was rendered utterly, completely speechless. His face, a moment before a picture of arrogant power, was now a pale, slack mask of pure shock. The blood had drained from it, leaving behind a waxy, almost gray pallor. His mouth was slightly agape, as if he intended to speak, but his brain had forgotten how to form words. He stared at Alara, but it was clear he wasn't seeing a waitress anymore. He was seeing a ghost, a specter from a past he had long since buried and forgotten. A past that had just risen up to confront him in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. The young associate, David, looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His face was a kaleidoscope of conflicting emotions, terror, confusion, and a dawning horrified respect for the woman standing before them. He had idolized Marcus Thorne, viewed him as an invincible titan of finance. In the span of less than 60 seconds, this waitress had not only proven herself to be Thorne's intellectual superior, but had also hinted at a dark criminal past. He felt the foundations of his own ambition begin to crumble, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the plush upholstery of the booth, to be anywhere but here, a witness to the complete and total dismantling of his mentor. The entire world he had been so desperate to join suddenly seemed fragile and rotten. Thorne's shock slowly, painstakingly began to recede, replaced by something far more dangerous. A dark, mottled flush crept up his neck, spreading across his cheeks. It was the color of pure, undiluted rage. His ego, the massive, carefully constructed edifice upon which his entire identity was built, had not just been bruised, it had been shattered into a million pieces. And it had been done by a nobody, a servant, in front of his protégé. The humiliation was a physical toxin flooding his system. He could feel the eyes of nearby diners on them, drawn by the palpable tension. His hands, which had been resting on the table, clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists, the heavy gold ring on his finger digging into his skin. His breathing became shallow, his nostrils flaring with each sharp intake of air. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell or cause a scene. His fury was too deep, too absolute for such a theatrical display. It was a cold, silent rage, the kind that condensed into something hard and lethal. He recovered a sliver of his composure, his expression hardening into a mask of icy contempt. His eyes, now burning with a venomous hatred, locked onto Alara. He lifted one hand, a single, imperious finger raised to summon the manager. The gesture was small, but it was imbued with all the power and privilege he possessed. It was the gesture of a man who was accustomed to having the world bend to his will, a man who was about to remind this woman and everyone else of her place in that world. The manager, a perpetually flustered man named Julian, scurried over to the table, his face etched with anxiety. He had seen Thorne's signal from across the room and had felt a jolt of pure terror. A displeased Marcus Thorne was not just a complaint, it was a potential catastrophe for the restaurant's reputation and bottom line. He approached the table with a practiced, apologetic smile already plastered on his face, ready to offer complimentary champagne, a free meal, anything to placate the Titan. "Good evening, Mr. Thorne," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" He studiously avoided looking at Alara, though he could feel the glacial tension emanating from her. Thorne did not even grant the manager a glance. His eyes remained fixed on Alara, a predator staring down its prey. He spoke 2 words, his voice low, flat, and devoid of any emotion save for a chilling, final authority. "She's fired." The words were not a request or a complaint. They were a command, an imperial decree. He then added, with a deliberate, cruel slowness, his gaze boring into Alara's, "Now, get her out of my sight." The finality in his tone was absolute, leaving no room for discussion or appeal. It was the raw, brutal exercise of power, the swatting of a fly that had dared to buzz too close to the king. Julian the manager froze, his obsequious smile collapsing. He looked from Thorne's face, a mask of cold fury, to Alara's, which remained unnervingly calm and composed. He was caught in an impossible position. He knew Alara was one of his best employees, efficient, professional, and completely reliable. But Marcus Thorne was not just a customer. He was an institution. Losing his patronage could have devastating consequences. The internal conflict lasted only a second. Fear won, as it so often does in the face of overwhelming power. He turned to Alara, his expression a miserable mix of apology and cowardice. "Alara," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, "please, just go, pack your things." Alara did not argue, she did not plead. She did not offer a single word in her own defense. To do so would have been to grant them a power over her they no longer possessed. She had said what needed to be said. The truth had been spoken, and the consequences, she knew, were inevitable. She gave Thorne one last, long look. It was not a look of hatred or fear, but one of profound, pitying contempt. In that moment, she saw him for what he truly was. Not a titan, but a small, pathetic man, so terrified of his own mediocrity that he had to build an empire of cruelty to feel powerful. She then turned without a word to the trembling manager and walked away from the table. Her walk across the opulent dining room of Aurelia was the longest walk of her life. She could feel every eye in the restaurant on her back, 100 pairs of curious, judging gazes. The hushed murmurs followed her like a wave. She kept her back straight, her head held high, her steps measured and even. She was not a disgraced servant being cast out. She was a queen abdicating a throne she had never wanted. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance. She passed tables laden with extravagant food she could never afford, past patrons dripping with jewels and casual entitlement, and she felt not a shred of envy or loss. She felt only a profound, cleansing sense of liberation. The invisible chains of servitude that had bound her for years had just been shattered. She reached the staff entrance at the back of the restaurant, pushing through the swinging doors that separated the gilded cage of the dining room from the stark, utilitarian chaos of the kitchen. The clatter of pots and pans, the shouts of the chefs, the humid, greasy air. It was a different world back here, the engine room of the luxury liner. She went to her small locker, her movements still calm and methodical. She removed her apron, folding it neatly and placing it on the shelf. As she changed out of her uniform and into her street clothes, the adrenaline that had sustained her for the past 10 minutes began to fade, and the cold, hard reality of her situation began to seep in. She had just been fired. She had no job, no income, and a mountain of medical bills that waited for no one. Her father's care facility cost over $12,000 a month, a sum that had already devoured her family's savings and her own meager earnings. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. What have I done? The question screamed in her mind. For a moment, the image of her father, his eyes vacant, his body frail, filled her with a crushing sense of guilt. She had risked his well-being, his safety, for a single moment of righteous satisfaction. The weight of her responsibility, of his complete and total dependence on her, pressed down on her with suffocating force. She stepped out of the restaurant's back alley into the cold New York City night. The air was crisp and smelled of rain and exhaust fumes, a stark contrast to the perfumed atmosphere of Aurelia. The city lights glittered around her, a galaxy of indifferent stars. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders and began the long walk to the subway station. The panic was still there, a frantic, fluttering bird trapped in her chest, but as she walked, another feeling began to rise alongside it. It was the feeling of a deep, resonant rightness. She had spent years swallowing her rage, choking down her grief, hiding her true self behind a mask of deference. Tonight, she had finally taken off the mask. She had spoken truth to power. She thought of Marcus Thorne's face. The image of his shock and fury seared into her memory. The satisfaction of that moment was a warm coal glowing in the pit of her stomach. It was not just that she had exposed his ignorance. It was that she had forced him to see her. For one brief, glorious moment, she had not been a piece of furniture or an invisible servant. She had been Ilara Vance, daughter of Dr. Alistair Vance, a Yale law prodigy and his intellectual and moral superior. She had reclaimed her own name, her own identity from the man who had tried to erase her family from existence. And that, she realized, was worth more than any job. By the time she reached her small, third-floor walk-up apartment in a less fashionable part of the city, the panic had subsided, replaced by something hard and clear. It was resolve. She unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet space that was both her sanctuary and her prison. The air was filled with the faint, antiseptic smell of her father's medical supplies. On a small table by the window sat a framed photograph. It was of her father, years ago, standing proudly in front of his new laboratory, his arm around a much younger, smiling Ilara on the day she received her acceptance letter to Yale. His eyes in the photo were bright with intelligence, kindness, and boundless hope. She picked up the photograph, her thumb gently tracing the outline of her father's face. The humiliation she had endured tonight was nothing compared to the slow, grinding humiliation he had suffered. He had lost his company, his health, his voice. Marcus Thorne had taken everything from him, and had never once had to answer for it. Embarrassing Thorne in a restaurant was not justice. It was a prelude. It was the opening salvo in a war she had just declared. A cold, crystalline certainty settled over her. She would not be a victim anymore. She would not be defined by her grief or her circumstances. She would become the weapon that her father could no longer be. She walked over to a dusty bookshelf and pulled out a worn, leather-bound volume. It was her old constitutional law textbook from Yale. She opened it, the smell of old paper and ink filling her small apartment. It felt like an eternity since she had last held it, a relic from another life. But as her fingers traced the lines of text, the familiar thrill of intellectual combat, of navigating the complex architecture of the law, came rushing back. The knowledge was still there, dormant but not dead. Her mind, which she had forced into the simple, repetitive tasks of a waitress, began to stir, to awaken, to remember what it was capable of. She sat down at her small desk and opened her aging laptop. The screen flickered to life, illuminating her face in its cool blue light. For years, this laptop had been used for little more than paying bills online and searching for caregiver support groups. Now it was going to be her command center. She knew that what Thorne had done to her father's company, Vantage Biotherapeutics, was not just ruthless, it was illegal. She had always suspected it, but back then she was just a student, and her family was too broken and exhausted to fight. They had been outmaneuvered by Thorne's army of high-priced lawyers. But she wasn't a student anymore. She was a survivor, and she had nothing left to lose. Her first move had to be strategic. She couldn't fight Thorne alone. He was a leviathan, protected by layers of wealth, influence, and legal firepower. She needed an ally, someone with the resources and the institutional credibility to help her navigate the treacherous waters ahead. Her mind immediately went to one person, Professor Alistair Finch, her former mentor at Yale Law School. He was a titan in the world of corporate law, a man who had not only written the definitive textbook on securities fraud, but had also spent his career advocating for ethical corporate governance. He had been devastated when she'd had to drop out, and he had never stopped believing in her potential. With trembling but determined fingers, she began to type. She composed an email, her words measured and precise, laying out the events of the evening in stark, factual detail. She recounted the confrontation at Aurelia, Thorne's inadvertent confession, and her own dismissal. She then connected it to the past, to the brutal takeover of Vantage Biotherapeutics, and her long-held suspicion of securities fraud. She didn't write with emotion or plea for sympathy. She wrote like the lawyer she was meant to be, presenting a case, laying out the facts, and proposing a course of action. She was not asking for a handout, she was proposing a partnership, a quest for justice. She attached a single file to the email, an old, forgotten business plan for her father's company, detailing the proprietary research that Thorne had acquired for pennies on the dollar and later sold for a fortune. It was the only piece of evidence she had managed to save from the wreckage of their lives. She reread the email one last time, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the point of no return. By sending this message, she was stepping out of the shadows and onto the battlefield. She was consciously choosing to reignite a fight that had nearly destroyed her family once before. But this time, she was not an innocent bystander. This time, she would be the one wielding the sword. Her finger hovered over the send button for a long, breathless moment. The risks were immense. Thorne was a powerful, vindictive man. He could crush her, ruin her life in ways she couldn't even imagine. But then, the image of her father, trapped in the prison of his own body, his brilliant mind silenced, flashed before her eyes once more. The fear she felt was eclipsed by a fierce, protective love. This was not for her. This was for him. This was for the legacy of a good man who had tried to make the world a better place. With a final deep breath that felt like both a prayer and a war cry, she clicked the mouse. The email disappeared into the digital ether, a declaration of war sent out into the darkness of the night. The digital silence that followed the click of the send button was louder than any sound she had ever heard. It was a vacuum a chasm of possibility and peril that stretched into the long hours of the New York night. Ilara sat in the cool, blue glow of her laptop screen, her body rigid, her breath held tight in her chest. She had not moved for what felt like an eternity, her mind replaying the words she had written, dissecting every sentence, every comma. Had she been too bold? Too emotional? Had she presumed too much on the memory of a professor from a life that no longer felt like her own? The hope she had felt was a fragile, terrifying thing, a tiny flame flickering in the vast darkness of her uncertainty. Every creak of the old apartment building, every distant siren wail was a potential answer, a harbinger of either salvation or a deeper, more profound ruin. She felt utterly exposed, as if she had cast her last and only stone into an indifferent ocean, and was now left to wait, stranded on the shore, wondering if it would create a ripple or simply sink without a trace. Miles away, in a book-lined study that smelled of aged leather and strong black tea, Professor Alistair Finch read Ilara's email for the third time. The screen of his tablet cast a pale light on his face, illuminating the deep lines of concentration etched around his eyes. He remembered Ilara Vance vividly, not just as a student, but as a force of nature. She had possessed an intellect so sharp and a passion for the law so pure that it had reinvigorated his own love for the profession. Her sudden departure from Yale had been a deep and lasting disappointment, a mystery he had never fully understood. Now, reading her words, the mystery was solved, replaced by a cold, rising anger. He felt a profound sense of institutional shame. The very legal system he had dedicated his life to teaching had been twisted into a weapon against one of his brightest protégés and her family. The name Marcus Thorne was poison in the world of ethical finance, a byword for predatory capitalism. The story Ilara laid out was not just tragic, it was a call to arms that his conscience could not ignore. His response was immediate and decisive. There was no hesitation, no weighing of risks. He typed a short, simple reply. "My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. I will clear my schedule. We will fight this." After sending the message, he rose from his chair and walked to the large window overlooking the quiet, tree-lined streets of New Haven. The name Vantage Biotherapeutics echoed in his memory. He recalled the whispers in the financial press years ago, a promising small firm that had been swallowed whole, its innovative research absorbed, and its founder left in ruins. At the time, it had been just another sad story of a shark devouring a smaller fish. But now, with Ilara's testimony, it was no longer a statistic. It had a human face, a human cost. A grim determination settled upon him. He had spent the last 20 years of his life teaching the theory of justice. It was time, he thought, to engage in the practice of it once more. The next morning, stepping into Professor Finch's office felt like stepping into a different dimension. The air was still and smelled of history. Sunlight streamed through a tall, arched window, illuminating dust motes dancing over thousands of books that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. It was a sanctuary of knowledge, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence of Aurelia and the cramped anxiety of her own apartment. Professor Finch was not the imposing academic figure she remembered from the lecture hall. He greeted her with a warmth that instantly eased the knot of tension in her stomach. He poured her a cup of tea with his own hands, his movements calm and reassuring. He listened, truly listened, as she recounted the story again, this time filling in the painful details of her father's decline and her own years of silent struggle. He didn't interrupt, his gaze never wavering, his expression a mixture of deep empathy and simmering righteous fury. When she finished, there was a long, respectful silence in the room. Professor Finch leaned forward, his hands clasped on his large oak desk. "Ilara," he said, his voice imbued with a quiet power that resonated through the room, "what Marcus Thorne did was not just unethical. I am convinced it was criminal. The problem, as you well know, is that men like him are masters at sanitizing their tracks. They build legal fortresses around their actions, leaving a paper trail so clean it shines. But every fortress has a crack. Our job is to find it." He then stood up and gestured to the vast library around them. "You will have access to everything. The university's LexisNexis account, our private archives, every resource we have at our disposal is now yours. You are no longer a waitress, Elara. You are lead counsel on the most important case of your life." For the first time in years, Elara felt a surge of something she had thought long dead, a sense of purpose. "But we cannot do this alone," Finch continued, his tone becoming more strategic. "Thorne's legal team is an army. We are, for now, a resistance of two. We need a different kind of weapon. We need to fight him not just in the courtroom of law, but in the court of public opinion." He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. "I know a man," he said, "a journalist. Liam Riley. He's one of the last of a dying breed of investigative reporters. He's tenacious, cynical, and he has a bloodhound's nose for corporate corruption. More importantly, he has a personal history with our target. Thorne fed him a false story years ago that nearly destroyed his career. Liam has been waiting for a chance to settle that score ever since. He's the ally we need. He can open doors for us that a lawsuit never could." Finch's words painted a clear picture of the battlefield ahead, and for the first time Elara saw a viable path to victory. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cycle of caffeine-fueled research and sleepless nights. The Yale Law Library became her new home. She spent hours, then days, hunched over a Carol in a forgotten corner, the glow of the computer screen her only light. The world outside ceased to exist. The rustle of turning pages and the soft clicking of her keyboard were the only sounds in her universe. It was a painful and exhilarating reawakening. Her mind, so long forced into the mundane rhythm of taking orders and carrying plates, stretched and flexed, rediscovering its old power. The intricate language of SEC filings, prospectuses, and quarterly reports, once a source of academic fascination, was now a battlefield map. She navigated the labyrinth of Thorne Capital's corporate structure, tracing the lines of shell corporations and offshore holding companies, searching for the slightest inconsistency, the smallest crack in the edifice. The work was grueling. Thorne's lawyers had been meticulous. Every acquisition, every transaction, every filing was a masterclass in legal obfuscation. The takeover of Vantage Biotherapeutics was documented with perfect, cold precision. On paper, it was a flawless, if aggressive, business deal. There was no hint of the misinformation campaign, no trace of the predatory short selling that had crippled her father's stock price. Frustration began to mount, a cold tide of despair lapping at the edges of her resolve. She would spend an entire day following a money trail only to have it disappear into a legally sound but morally bankrupt tax haven. It felt like punching a ghost. The fortress Thorne had built seemed impenetrable, and with each dead end, the fear that he was truly untouchable grew stronger. It was during one of these moments of near surrender that Professor Finch arranged the meeting with Liam Riley. The journalist's office was the polar opposite of Finch's academic sanctuary. It was a cluttered, chaotic space in a rundown building in Hell's Kitchen, smelling of stale coffee and old newspapers. The walls were a chaotic collage of maps, photographs, and scribbled notes connected by a web of red string. Liam himself was a man who looked like he ran on nicotine and righteous indignation. He was rumpled and restless, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He listened to Elara's story with a hawk-like intensity, his initial cynicism slowly melting away, replaced by the familiar gleam of a predator catching a scent. When she finished, he leaned back in his squeaking chair and gave a low whistle. "Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I knew that son of a witch was a snake. I just never had the proof." Liam's contribution to the investigation was immediate and invaluable. While Elara was an expert in the language of documents and data, Liam was an expert in the language of people. He knew that corporate crimes weren't just committed on paper, they were committed by people with secrets, grievances, and weaknesses. He opened a battered filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled simply Thorne. It was his life's work, a collection of every contact, every source, every disgruntled ex-employee he had ever cultivated in his years of covering the man. He spread the contents across his desk. "These are the people Thorne chewed up and spit out," he explained. "Most of them are too scared to talk. But fear fades. Guilt lasts forever. Our job is to find the one whose guilt is finally heavier than their fear." Their focus quickly narrowed to one name: Gregory Stowe, the former chief financial officer of Thorne Capital. According to Liam's notes, Stowe had resigned abruptly about 6 months after the Vantage Biotherapeutics acquisition, citing, quote, "personal reasons." The official story was that he had retired to a quiet life upstate, but Liam's source whispered that he had been forced out after a heated disagreement with Thorne. He had been given a generous severance package, but it came with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Stowe was the man who would have handled the financials of the takeover. If there was a skeleton in Thorne's closet, Stowe was the one who had helped bury it. Finding him and convincing him to talk became their singular obsession. He was no longer just a name on a page. He was the key. The hunt for Gregory Stowe was a delicate operation. Liam used his network of contacts, a web of old-school journalism and discreet inquiries, to track him down. He wasn't living in a luxury retirement community, but in a small, unassuming rental house in a sleepy town in the Catskills. He was living off the grid, paying for everything in cash, a man clearly trying to be invisible. A direct approach would be a disaster. It would send him running for cover. They needed a more subtle strategy. Alara spent a week doing nothing but researching Stowe. She read old interviews, looked up his college records, and even found his wife's social media profiles from years ago. She learned about his hobbies, his interests, and the life he had lived before Thorne. She was not just preparing for an interview, she was preparing for an infiltration, a mission to connect with the man behind the wall of fear. Alara traveled to the small town alone. The place was a world away from the relentless energy of New York City. The air was clean and smelled of pine, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind in the trees. It was a place where people went to escape, to forget. She found Stowe exactly where Liam's source said he would be, sitting on the same park bench every morning, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee from a thermos. He looked older than his photographs, his face a roadmap of anxiety. She didn't approach him with a notebook and a list of questions. Instead, she began her own routine, sitting on a nearby bench each morning, reading a book on a topic she knew he was passionate about: 19th century maritime history. For 3 days they sat in comfortable silence, two strangers sharing a quiet morning ritual. On the 4th day, she accidentally dropped her book as he was walking past. He stooped to pick it up, his eyes widening slightly as he read the title. "An excellent choice," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. That was her opening. She engaged him in a conversation not about finance or Marcus Thorne, but about naval battles and shipbuilding. She let him talk, listened to the passion in his voice as he spoke about something he loved. She saw a glimpse of the man he had been before his life had been derailed. She was building a bridge of trust, one careful plank at a time, across the chasm of his fear. Finally, on the 5th morning, after establishing a fragile rapport, she took the leap. She didn't accuse him or threaten him. She simply looked at him and said, "My father was a builder. He built a company that was meant to save children's lives. He was a good man, and someone came along and destroyed everything he built, and in doing so, destroyed him." She spoke quietly, her voice filled not with anger, but with a profound and unshakable grief. She never mentioned Thorne's name. She didn't have to. She saw a flicker of recognition in Stowe's eyes, a shadow of a shared pain. He had been a builder once, too, before he had become a destroyer's accomplice. Gregory Stowe's composure, so carefully maintained for years, finally crumbled. He didn't confess in a rush of words. Instead, a single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. He looked around the quiet park as if expecting Thorne's assassins to emerge from behind the trees. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a barely audible whisper, thick with years of suffocated guilt. "I couldn't stop him," he rasped. "He was a force of nature. He would have ruined me, my family. But I always knew. I always knew it was wrong." He then gave her the key, the cryptic clue that would change everything, the server backups. The official records were wiped, but they never purged the offsite archives. The project code was Phoenix. He said it was Thorne's private joke, rising from the ashes of the companies he burned. The phrase offsite archives was a bolt of lightning. It was the crack in the fortress they had been searching for. Getting access, however, would be nearly impossible. These facilities were digital Fort Knoxes, protected by layers of physical and virtual security. A court order would take months, and would alert Thorne that they were closing in. Liam, once again, turned to his network. He found an insider, a disgruntled senior IT technician at Thorne Capital, who was about to be laid off as part of a restructuring. The man had no love for Marcus Thorne and a deep-seated resentment for the company's cutthroat culture. For a promise of anonymity and a small contribution to his early retirement, he was willing to provide them with a window of opportunity. The plan was audacious and fraught with risk. The IT technician gave them a 4-hour window during a scheduled system-wide maintenance check at a data storage facility in a desolate industrial park in New Jersey. During that time, security protocols would be partially relaxed. He provided Alara with a temporary access code and a map of the server architecture. The night of the operation was cold and rainy. Alara and Liam sat in a nondescript van across the street from the facility, the glow of a laptop screen illuminating their tense faces. Alara, guided by the technician over a secure line, remotely accessed Thorne Capital's archives. It was a digital heist, a high-stakes race against a ticking clock. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind a whirlwind of command prompts and directory trees. The sheer volume of data was staggering, terabytes of information, a digital ghost of the company's entire history. She followed Stowe's clue, searching for the project code Phoenix. For what felt like an eternity, she found nothing. The maintenance window was closing. The risk of detection was growing with every passing minute. Then, she saw it. A partitioned drive, mislabeled, and hidden deep within a subdirectory of archived accounting files. Its name was a simple string of random numbers, but its creation date matched the timeline of the Vantage takeover. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she bypassed the weak encryption. Inside was a single compressed folder. Its name was Phoenix. As the massive file began to download, the slow progress bar on her screen was the most suspenseful thing she had ever witnessed. Every percentage point was a victory. With less than 10 minutes to spare, the download completed. She severed the connection, wiped their digital footprints, and leaned back in her seat, her body trembling with adrenaline. They drove back to the city in silence, the laptop containing the folder sitting between them like a holy relic or an unexploded bomb. They didn't know what they had, but they knew it was the secret that Gregory Stowe had been hiding for years. Back in the safety of Professor Finch's office, the three of them gathered around the computer screen. The air was thick with anticipation. Alara unzipped the file. It contained hundreds of documents, but her eyes were drawn to a subfolder simply labeled Correspondence. She clicked it open. And there they were. A chain of emails between Marcus Thorne and the head of a boutique ratings agency that had published a devastatingly negative and ultimately fraudulent report on Vantage Biotherapeutics just days before the takeover bid. The emails were cold, clinical, and utterly damning. They laid out in Thorne's own words the plan to aggressively devalue her father's company through targeted negative press and analyst downgrades to trigger a panic sell-off. Reading the words was like watching a recording of her father's execution. Thorne wrote about destroying a man's life's work with the same detached language he would use to order lunch. He had paid the agency over $2 million to falsify their report, a pittance to him, but a death blow to her father. This was it, the smoking gun. The irrefutable, undeniable proof of securities fraud, market manipulation, and conspiracy. It was the weapon they had been searching for, a blade forged in the very fire that had consumed her family. A profound, solemn silence fell over the room. There was no elation, no triumphant cheer. There was only the heavy, grim satisfaction of a truth finally, brutally brought to light. The question now was how to use it. A legal battle would still take years, a war of attrition that Thorn, with his immense resources, could still potentially win. They needed to do more than just defeat him. They needed to annihilate his power, his reputation, the very foundation of his empire. Liam was the one who proposed the stage for the final confrontation. Thorn Capital's annual charity gala, a lavish affair held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was the pinnacle of Thorn's public relations campaign, where he presented himself as a benevolent philanthropist, a pillar of the community. It was the night he was at his most visible, his most arrogant, and his most vulnerable. The plan began to form, a complex and beautiful piece of strategic warfare. Liam would use his press credentials to get himself and Alara into the event. The IT technician would provide them with a backdoor into the gala's audiovisual system. Professor Finch would prepare a legal summary of the evidence, ready to be distributed to every major news outlet the moment the trap was sprung. Alara held a copy of the gala invitation in her hand. The heavy, gold-embossed cardstock felt cold to the touch. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of the laptop, and for the first time, she did not see the ghost of a waitress or the shadow of a grieving daughter. She saw a warrior, armed with the truth, ready to walk into the heart of the enemy's fortress and burn it to the ground. The time for hiding was over. The time for justice had come. The Grand Hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was not merely a room, it was a cathedral consecrated to the religion of money. Bathed in the warm, golden light of towering floral arrangements and the soft glow from priceless works of art, the space hummed with the carefully modulated murmur of the city's most powerful figures. The air itself felt different here, thinner and richer, scented with expensive perfume and the crisp, clean aroma of influence. Waiters in starched white jackets moved like silent ghosts through the glittering assembly, their silver trays laden with champagne flutes that sparkled like captured stars. Alara Vance moved through this world not as a servant, but as an invited guest. A Trojan horse in a simple but elegant, dark blue dress that she had bought from a consignment shop. On her arm was Liam Riley, his rumpled suit, a small act of rebellion in this sea of bespoke tuxedos. He was her press credential, her entry past the velvet ropes, but she was the weapon. Her heart was a cold, steady drum against her ribs. She felt no fear, only a terrifying, crystalline clarity. Across the room, she saw him. Marcus Thorn, surrounded by a sycophantic court, laughing, his teeth white against his tanned skin. He was a king in his castle, utterly oblivious to the executioner who had just walked through his gates. Thorn ascended the stage to a wave of enthusiastic applause that echoed through the vast vaulted space. He stood at the podium, a figure of impeccable power and charisma, bathed in the soft glow of a single spotlight. He looked out at the sea of faces, his expression one of benevolent authority, a shepherd addressing his flock. His speech began, a symphony of carefully crafted hypocrisy. He spoke of legacy, of giving back, of the solemn duty of the successful to uplift society. He used words like integrity, transparency, and corporate responsibility, and the words fell from his lips with a practiced sincerity that made Alara's stomach clench. With every hollow platitude, she saw the truth. She saw the stack of legal notices on her family's kitchen table. She saw the predatory language in the fine print of the takeover documents. She saw the light in her father's eyes dimming day by day. The crowd was captivated, hanging on his every word, seeing a philanthropist, a titan of industry. Alara saw only the architect of her family's ruin, a man performing a grotesque parody of the goodness he had spent his life destroying. The applause line about building a better future for our children was the final, unbearable irony. As the applause subsided, Thorn smiled, a picture of magnanimous grace. He held up a hand, silencing the room. In the spirit of transparency, he said, his voice resonating with false humility, I'd be happy to take a question or two. It was a classic Thorne maneuver, a performance of openness that was really an exercise in control. He expected a softball question from a friendly journalist or a fawning compliment from a business partner. He did not expect the slender, determined hand that rose from the middle of the room. Ilara's arm felt impossibly heavy, as if she were trying to lift the weight of the past decade. But she held it steady. Thorne's gaze swept the room and landed on her. He saw an unfamiliar, attractive young woman in a simple dress. A hint of a condescending smile touched his lips. He nodded graciously, a king granting an audience to a commoner. "Yes, you," he said, gesturing for a microphone to be brought to her. The entire room, hundreds of pairs of powerful eyes, turned to face her. In that moment, the world seemed to shrink, and all that existed was the spotlight, the microphone, and the face of the man who had taken everything from her. The microphone felt cold and heavy in her hand. Her voice, when it came, did not tremble. It was calm, clear, and carried a precise, surgical chill that cut through the warm, self-congratulatory atmosphere of the gala. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her eyes locked on his, "you speak of building a better future with ethical growth. I wonder if you could elaborate on the specific ethical strategy you employed during the 2014 acquisition of a small firm called Vantage Biotherapeutics, particularly concerning the independent analyst reports that were published just days before your tender offer became public." The name, Vantage Biotherapeutics, hung in the air for a moment, a ghost at the feast. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Thorne's face. Not recognition, but the faint annoyance of being confronted with a trivial detail from a long-forgotten conquest. He gave a small, dismissive laugh. "That was a long time ago," he said, his tone patronizing. "A very successful and, I might add, perfectly legal business transaction. It has no relevance to our discussion tonight." He waved his hand, a gesture of finality. "Next question." He tried to turn away, to dismiss her as he had dismissed so many others, but he had made a fatal error. He had engaged. He had walked directly into her trap. As he turned his back, attempting to select another questioner from the crowd, Ilara spoke again, her voice rising slightly in volume and intensity, imbued with an unshakable authority that commanded the room's attention. "Is it also irrelevant that those analyst reports were entirely fraudulent?" That question, a direct accusation of a federal crime, landed with the force of a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. At that exact, prearranged moment, the two massive projection screens flanking the stage, which had been displaying the shimmering logo of the Thorne Capital Foundation, flickered to black. For a single, heart-stopping second, there was only darkness. Then, they blinked back to life, not with the gala logo, but with the crisp, damning text of an email, magnified to a height of 20 feet. The sender's name at the top was Marcus Thorne. The recipient was the CEO of the ratings agency. The subject line read simply, "Project Phoenix." Thorne froze, his hands still outstretched, and slowly, with a dawning sense of absolute horror, he turned to look at the screens behind him. The blood drained from Marcus Thorne's face, leaving behind a waxy gray mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The room was utterly silent, the only sound, the soft, rhythmic clicking, as the screens began to cycle through the evidence Liam had prepared. One by one, the exhibits of his crime were laid bare for the world to see. There was the email chain, in his own arrogant words, outlining the strategy to aggressively devalue Vantage's stock through targeted negative press. There was the scanned copy of a wire transfer confirmation for $2 million, sent from an offshore shell corporation to the ratings agency. And then, the final, most damning slide, a direct quote from Thorne himself, an instruction to his team, unearthed from the server archives. "We don't just acquire them, we burn them to the ground. Then we can rise from their ashes." Project Phoenix. Ilara's voice, amplified by the sound system, provided the cold, dispassionate narration, explaining the significance of each piece of evidence, with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. The cameras that had been pointed at the stage, capturing his philanthropic triumph, now zoomed in on his face, capturing the complete and total disintegration of a titan. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny, to rage, but no sound came out. He was a king, naked and exposed, trapped in the spotlight on a stage of his own making, his empire of lies crumbling to dust around him. Type "Justice" in the comments if you got chills when Alara Vance finally exposed the truth. The stunned silence of the grand hall lasted for 10 agonizing seconds before it shattered into 1,000 pieces. A chaotic wave of noise erupted, the frantic whispers of investors, the sharp intake of breath from his board members, the furious clicking of 100 cameras capturing his humiliation. His rivals in the audience looked on with undisguised glee, sharks smelling blood in the water. Members of the press, led by a triumphant Liam Riley, surged toward the stage, shouting questions that felt like stones being hurled at a broken statue. Thorne stumbled backward, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and impotent fury. His security detail rushed forward, forming a protective cordon around him and hustling him off the stage and out a side exit, not as a titan being escorted, but as a criminal being spirited away from a crime scene. Alara stood her ground in the midst of the maelstrom she had unleashed. She watched him go, feeling not a surge of vindictive joy, but a deep, quiet, and profound sense of peace. The ghost that had haunted her family for a decade had finally been exorcised. The truth, her father's truth, had been spoken, and its echo was now shaking the foundations of the city. In the weeks that followed, the world watched as the empire of Marcus Thorne imploded with spectacular speed. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched a full-scale investigation, freezing his assets and raiding his offices. His board of directors, in a desperate act of self-preservation, unanimously voted to oust him. He was buried under an avalanche of shareholder lawsuits and faced a litany of federal criminal charges that would likely see him spend the rest of his life in prison. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alara sat by her father's bedside in the quiet, sunlit room of his care facility. The incessant news coverage of Thorne's downfall played softly on a television in the corner. She held her father's frail hand in hers, the skin thin and papery, and she told him everything. She told him that his name was cleared, that the world now knew the truth of what had been done to him, that his legacy as a brilliant, honest man was restored. He could not speak, he could not move, but as she finished her story, she saw a single, clear tear form in the corner of his eye and trace a slow path down his cheek. It was a message of recognition, of pride, of love, and it was the only victory that had ever truly mattered. A month later, she received a call from a woman named Catherine Sterling, the formidable CEO of a rival investment firm and one of the most respected figures on Wall Street. She had been in the audience at the gala that night. They met in Sterling's office, a space filled with modern art and light that overlooked Central Park. "I didn't call you because I felt sorry for you," Sterling said, her gaze direct and appraising. "I called you because I have spent 20 years competing against men like Thorne. I know what it takes to beat them. What you did that night was not just revenge. It was the most brilliant and courageous act of strategic litigation I have ever witnessed. I don't see a victim. I see one of the most formidable legal minds I have ever encountered." She leaned forward, a proposal in her eyes. "I am starting a new division at my firm, focused on corporate accountability and ethical investment. Its purpose will be to find and support the next generation of companies like your father's, and to protect them from predators like Thorne. I don't want to offer you a job, Ms. Vance. I want to offer you a command. I want you to build it and run it." Alara Vance stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her new office, a corner suite with a commanding view of the New York City skyline. Below her, the city pulsed with life, a complex ecosystem of ambition and dreams. For so long she had been on the outside looking in, an invisible servant in the gilded cages of the powerful. Now she was one of its architects. Her father was in a new, state-of-the-art facility, receiving the best care money could buy, his comfort and dignity finally secured. Her work was no longer about survival, it was about purpose. She spent her days identifying and nurturing small, innovative companies, the kind of businesses built on a dream, just like her father's had been. She was using her formidable intellect not as a weapon of destruction, but as a shield for the vulnerable and a tool for creation. Her journey had not been a quest for vengeance, but a reclamation of justice, a transformation born from the ashes of a great injustice. She had not only honored her father's legacy, she had become its living, breathing continuation, a force for good in the very world that had once tried so hard to break her. If Alara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.